let's look at two bits of research which come not really from behavioral science, but they come from evolutionary science. The social brain hypothesis, that humans evolved big brains not to understand the world, but to understand each other. I was talking to, I think it might have been Robin Dunbar, where he said, if you're a monkey, okay, what is the most complicated thing you can introduce to my environment? Which, you know, and the answer is actually, it's not a tree, it's not a lion, it's not a tiger. You know what the tiger's trying to do. That's relatively easy to figure out what a tiger's up to and the fact that you should avoid it. The thing that makes things really complicated is another monkey, okay? So there's the social brain hypothesis, which is that we essentially naturally think in social terms rather than conventionally rational terms. We have something you might call ecological rationality. And the second thing is the argumentative hypothesis, which comes from Mercier and Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber, two French anthropologists, essentially, or psychologists, who argue that in many cases we evolved the faculty of reason not to actually make decisions, but to argue for a course of action, to defend our decisions, or to assess and quality check the arguments of others. And so in this case, one of the things they notice, which would be undoubtedly an outcome if the theory is true, is that people would choose a course of action which was easier to defend rather than a course of action which was actually better. That in other words, we may choose behaviors on their defensibility, not on their optimality. And that takes you into the field of defensive decision-making. And my little oversimplification, I acknowledge it's an oversimplification, but it's a useful point to make, I think, nonetheless, is that in consumer decision-making, we try and minimize the risk of regret. And in collective or institutional decision-making, government, politics, the public sector, whatever, we try and minimize the risk of blame. And therefore, we are much, much more inclined to do those things which either don't look like a decision at all, which seem uncontroversial, or which seem hyper-rational. In other words, a lot of the quest for data is the old lamppost problem. It's for support, not illumination. And that a large part of company behavior is probably arse covering disguised as rigor. That actually the reason those people are doing it is not to protect their company, but to protect their career within the company. And once you understand the asymmetry of incentives that exist within companies, it's hardly surprising that people behave this way. Because outside of, you know, a city trading floor or a very large bank, okay, the downside risk, you lose your job, your promotion prospects get destroyed, is immense in an organization, whereas the upside opportunity is actually relatively small. Okay, there is no likelihood that WPP will ever voluntarily, regardless of anything I do, give me £250,000. But there is there are 1,000 different things I could do tomorrow which would get me fired within an instant. And so once you look at the fact that, consumers generally have a reasonably balanced calibration of upside opportunity and downside risk, and understanding how different consumers are calibrated that way and reassuring them that, this is a low regret decision is good marketing. In B2B, you have to convince them of two things, probably, that it's a good decision, but more important, perhaps, is that it's a decision which, regardless of the consequences, it will be easy to defend the part you played in making it. And so I think this leads to all kinds of extraordinary biases. I mean, one of the examples of defensive decision-making we always noticed was what we called in the behavioral science practice, the Heathrow effect. People, whenever you asked for flights, people would always give you a list of flights from Heathrow to JFK. And you go, well, hold on, our office is closer to Newark. Newark is arguably a better airport than New York. I live much closer to Gatwick or London City than I do to Heathrow. Why are you only giving me Heathrow to JFK flights, options? And I'd have to go back and say, please, can you give me some flights from Newark? I couldn't understand what was going on. And then I realized, of course, Heathrow JFK is the default. If anything goes wrong on that route, I won't blame my PA, I won't blame my company travel agent, I'll blame British Airways, or I'll blame striking American air traffic controllers, I'll blame some external entity. If you book me spontaneously from Newark or from London City, if anything goes wrong, I might blame you, because you've now taken a non-standard decision, and I can ring you up and say, if you hadn't booked me from the sodding Toy Town airport, I would be in New York by now, okay? Now, one of the things I think we need to understand is that quite often we incentivize people individually in a very uneven way. In other words, there are far more ways they can be fired than there are ways in which they can be rewarded. And therefore, the gains to eccentric decision-making or creative exploration are smaller in business to the individual than they should be. But also, we tend to silo businesses, so the individual is given a very, very specific narrow function, which prevents him from having the autonomy to create value, or the incentive to create value by doing things that he isn't specifically tasked, or she obviously isn't specifically tasked to do. Okay? So if you give people very narrow metrics of success, they will start actually, first of all, to pursue those metrics to the exclusion of any other, possibly to the detriment of other metrics. Why should they care? Okay, I'm simply tasked to do this. And we know from systems thinking that you don't optimize an overall system by optimizing its parts individually. This is a case for synthesis, not analysis. People will also then pursue those gains to an extent which may be counterproductive. You know, getting people off the phone in a call center, okay, you know, probably might be rewarded, even though it leads to widespread customer dissatisfaction somewhere else in the organization. But also people will start to game the system. But their opportunity to be creative has also been curtailed, because nothing that improves the organization which doesn't fall into their direct area of responsibility will gain them any credit whatsoever. So they effectively become heavily compartmentalized. And this is actually a very, very upsetting state of affairs, which I think grotesquely distorts the energies of large organizations.